green horse, representing widespread disease. And so here we have all of these different events piling on top of each other. Once a seal is opened, it stays open. We recall again the real purpose of the book of Revelation, 1 verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And then he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. The word shortly here means in haste. Otherwise, it would make no sense. It's been 2,000 years since John received this revelation. It would make no sense to us in our human reckoning of time. But so it really means in haste or with speed. So these are things which will take place in rapid succession. They will transpire at a rapid pace once they happen. And we know that Jesus Christ said, this generation shall not pass until all these things are accomplished. What generation? The last generation of this age. And what is a generation? Well, the Bible is very loose in its definition of a generation. It could be 30 years or 40 years. It could be 100 years. It could be an average human lifetime. Different ways that the Bible interprets a generation, depending on where you are in the Bible when you're reading the term generation. So we understand that to mean the last period of time on this earth before Christ's return. Verse 3 of Revelation 1, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. Keep in mind that once God starts opening the understanding of this book, then these things can start happening at rapid succession. If you go back 1,000 years and people in religious communities are studying the book of Revelation, they don't comprehend anywhere near as much as you and I have been blessed to know about what's happening when we open this book. The title of the book of Revelation comes from the Greek word apokalypsis. That's where we get apocalypse. Apokalypsis simply means disclosure or revealing or revelation. It means laying bare or uncovering something that's been kept secret, and hence the word revelation. And keep in mind, this book was written specifically for the faithful in the New Testament church, specifically for the faithful. So the opening of the fifth seal, as it says in your handout, describes three major world events. One of those is, and we'll start talking about this one first, was the widespread persecution of the people of God for 3.5 years. Also, it's a time period of preaching by God's two witnesses, 3.5 years. Also, the third event is the time of Jacob's trouble, also called the Great Tribulation, and the unleashing of terrible destruction on the Israel of the Bible, generally the English-speaking peoples of the Bible. We'll look at that. But first of all, let's look at the first scripture next. It's Matthew 24, verse 9. Matthew 24, verse 9, this first event of Jesus Christ describing the persecution of this 3.5-year period. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. So you see now the whole view from the first 4 seals showing how mainly it's human beings causing troubles on the earth, and all the suffering that humankind has brought upon himself. Well, the 5th seal also falls in that category, but now we see a direct attack on the faithful, the saints of God, faithful believers who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus Christ, the testimony of Jesus Christ. Satan is not satisfied enough to see the suffering of vast millions, if not billions by this time, of humanity. In addition, he attacks the elect of God in an all-out effort to wipe them off the face of the planet. Here's the counterpart passage in Revelation 6, verse 9, to what we just read from Christ's words in Matthew. Revelation 6, verse 9, it's the symbolic cry of the martyrs. Throughout the history of the church, it goes back thousands of years. It says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out in a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe, that symbolizes spiritual purity, a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. Now we understand that the opening of the fifth seal is the allegory, the personification of the saints, as if they could speak. Obviously they can't. They're dead. People that are dead have no consciousness, no awareness. If they could speak, there are other parallels to this allegory in the Bible. Of course, we remember in the time when Cain killed his brother Abel, God said that Abel's blood was crying out from the ground. Well, obviously that's not it's not literal, but this is how God described it. And when Cain slew his brother. So here we see the plea of the martyred saints that have died over the centuries that must wait a little longer until, in their graves, until some threshold is reached that God has counted the number of martyrs. Some threshold that God uses. And then divine justice will be served to the oppressors who caused this persecution. Again, this is a short-lived period, 3.5 years. Now God looks very tenderly at the persecution of his saints, and we will come back to another Bible study after this at another time on the sixth seal. What happens after this 3.5-year period is the peeling open of the sixth seal of Revelation. And this is where all kinds of things bring terror to the earth. It's God finally stepping into human affairs. Again, we'll come back to that another time. Revelation 13, verse 5. Here it tells us of what the Bible describes as the second beast that's given power over every tribe, tongue, and nation for 3.5 years, and who will be Satan's instrument to bring about this final persecution, a second beast. Revelation 13, verses 5 through 7. Let's read. And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Daniel 7, verse 7 is the parallel here. It shows us that there is a fourth world-ruling empire which will have its final revival in this end-time age. It will have the characteristics of the first three world-ruling empires. Babylon was the first, Medo-Persia was the second, Greece was the third, and then the Roman Empire. And this will be the revival of the Roman Empire, one of 10 revivals. Verse 7, after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible. Now, this beast is the whole system of the Roman Empire, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring and breaking into pieces and trampling the residue with his feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. It had 10 revivals. The 10 horns would be 10 dominions of the Roman Empire over a period of 1,500 years. 1,500 years. Verse 8, John, John speaks of a little horn, which is the same as this second beast. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them. This is still in Daniel, actually, Daniel 7, verse 8. But this is the same as the second beast that Daniel sees in Revelation 13. And so Daniel says, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth speaking pompous words. What is this little horn? It is, again, a powerful religious system that would align with the last 7 of the 10 political horns that were to arise after the fall of the original Roman Empire. So there's this coordination between church and state for the last 7 of these revivals of Rome. And it becomes called the Holy Roman Empire at that point in time. And so this, again, there are 7 revivals of ancient Rome, which are now called the Holy Roman Empire, in which there is this combination between church and state, amalgam between them in their rulership. So Daniel 7, verse 24 is the parallel verse to Revelation 13. In your notes, it says, Daniel 7, verse 24 and 25, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones. He shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. You see what these 2 passages have in common, Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. It says, and then the saints will be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. In other words, 3.5 years. There's a day for a year principle I won't go into, but it's in Numbers 14, verse 34, and Ezekiel 4, verse 6, that the calculation is for 1,260 days, works out to 1,260 years. And here by that same principle, we see this time and times and half a time being 3.5 years. Evidence of that period of persecution, which went on for over 1,000 years, is seen through all the centuries. Hundreds and thousands of people, especially in Europe, lost their lives through inquisitions led by the Roman Catholic Church. They were tortured. They had to make forced confessions, and then they were labeled heretics, and then they were burned at the stake, and they were killed and tortured by all these horrible things because they would not submit to the authority and the doctrines of the Romish Church and the Pope. And so even though we've seen since the the last century, we've seen these inquisitions abolished, and we've seen a tremendous downgrading of the influence and power in the world of the Catholic Church to be able to do those things, the Bible indicates that this power will come back again, and that this little horn will result in many deaths again before Christ's return. So keep in mind that the second beast of Revelation 13, the little horn of Daniel 7, and the scarlet woman of Revelation 17, and the whole system of Babylon, they are the same thing. They are the same thing. They describe what we believe is the rise in influence and power again of the Roman Catholic Church. That's what we believe. Now, Daniel saw the conclusion of what happens to this little horn, this false religious leader, that when Jesus Christ returns, it says, the court, meaning the judgment, shall be seated. They shall take away his dominion. They shall consume and destroy it forever. That's in Revelation 18, verse 2, and also in Daniel 7, verse 26. Now let's see what else is happening during this 3.5 year period that brings us some comfort. At a most critical time, the church will be given divine protection away from Satan, and Satan will come with a rage because he'll know his time is short. But what happens when God's church is in a place of protection? Revelation 12, verse 6. But the woman, the true church, was given 2 wings of a great eagle, again, allegory, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time, time, and half a time. Time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years, from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. We've spoken before about describing the imagery here of perhaps a vast army of people. The Bible talks about that in a couple of different places, about a flood of people, calling them a flood. I mean, a mass of people all on the move, as if it were a flood. And so there is this analogy that's perhaps many people are being incited to come after God's people who are in a place of protection. But what happens? Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. If it's literal that a large group of people has come with some kind of a signal to come and attack God's faithful people that are in a place of protection, God provides for the earth to open up and swallow up that flood of people. That's one way of looking at this. And so the dragon, what happens next? Verse 17, the dragon, Satan, is enraged with the woman, with the true church. He went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So he is enraged, and he cannot get at those that God has allowed and provided for and been merciful to keep in a place of protection. And we're to pray always that we're accounted worthy to escape these things that shall come to pass. I'll end with that note. I'll quote. Now, during the same time as the period of the 2 witnesses are preaching for 3.5 years. Now, this we see from this one passage, Revelation 11, verse 3. Bible indications are that this coincides with the same period of the persecution of the church. Revelation 11, verses 3 through 6. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. Same as 3.5 years, same as 42 months. They will be clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. If anyone wants to harm these 2 witnesses, he or they must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut up heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophesying. And they have power over waters to turn them to blood and strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. None of these powers that God gives are any different than what has already happened in ancient times, especially when you look at the period that Moses was given these miracles to try to convince Pharaoh of Egypt to let God's people go, and then all these things came crushing down on Egypt because of the pride of Pharaoh. And it came down to the worst plague of all was the death of all the firstborn of all of Egypt. From human beings down to the cattle and the livestock. They all died. Now recall also 1 Kings chapter 1. I won't turn there, but Ahaziah was king of Israel, and he was very angry with Elijah because Elijah came and God told him, go tell Ahaziah, because he injured himself falling through some rafters in his house. He says, I want you to take a rebuke to Ahaziah because he called upon the god of Ekron, Beelzebub, for healing. And he says, is there not a God in heaven that can heal you? And so he says, you will not recover from your injuries. And so what happens next? Ahaziah is very angry at Elijah. Elijah's away on some hilltop hiding out, and here comes a captain of 50 soldiers that Ahaziah sends to go capture him, probably by any means necessary. Elijah says, if I am a man of God, then I call fire down from heaven to destroy you. Fire comes from heaven, and most of the time in the Bible, fire from heaven is really lightning. Now, it could be other things. There's fire and brimstone that have fallen in various times, but lightning is oftentimes used. It's the description used is fire from heaven. So we're not sure, exactly what came down out of heaven, but it killed all the 50 men and the captain. Ahaziah sends out another captain of 50, and same thing. Come down. We're going to take you. We're going to arrest you and take you back to King Ahaziah. If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and destroy all of you. All destroyed. Same thing. Third time, King Ahaziah sends a captain who is much more gracious, a lot more, shall we say, appealed to Elijah in a much more humble way, and Elijah went with them. But it was interesting what could it mean that fire proceeds out of their mouth? And it's just one of those things where if we look broadly at other examples in the Bible, it could be more than when they open their mouth, a flamethrower shoots out and burns up people. It could be different than that. It could be different. So this is where you look at some other cases in the Bible to build on some of the words or the things that we see in prophecy. So that happens for 3.5 years. What else happens? There's another event. The third aspect of opening the fifth seal is when the nations of modern-day Israel of the Bible experience the time of Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah 30, verse 7 describes this, and it's also essentially the same thing as the Great Tribulation. In our literature, we show that this looks like it's the exact same time frame. Genesis 48, verse 16 reveals that the patriarch Jacob explicitly placed his name on Ephraim and Manasseh. Remember, those were Joseph's two sons. But he's essentially adopting Joseph's sons as if they were his own. And so he puts his blessing by crossing his hands on the two boys. And in Genesis 48, you read all about the blessings. And we know that these were the fathers of the British Isles and the United States of America, by tracing back history to Ephraim and Manasseh and where their migration patterns went and the incredible blessings of these groups of nations have had in the end time, in the last couple hundred years, in that sense, in the last couple hundred years. So here we see, historically, the Judeo-Christian nations will be under this judgment. Hence the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, primarily the United States and Great Britain, along with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. They will bear the brunt of this terrible time ahead. I won't turn, but Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy 28 are two chapters which outline God's curses for those who know better. Those who understand God's laws, who have been given the tremendous blessings of having God's truth. And what more nations than the English-speaking peoples have had more Bibles and more teachers and more evangelists and more missionaries to go into than the English-speaking peoples. And so God will have a time of testing ahead. Ezekiel spoke of this future time of great tribulation as it pertains to Jerusalem before Christ's return. This is in Ezekiel 5, verse 7. Now, why just Jerusalem? Well, the city of Jerusalem is the former capital of the 12 tribes of Israel. It is representative of the nations and peoples who have been given the blessing of having the Ten Commandments, having the oracles of God, and their foundation of national constitutions and codes of conduct come from the Bible. So Ezekiel talks about this as being a day of clouds and a time of the Gentiles. Ezekiel 5, verses 7 through 10. Here's what God says to nations who should know better. Because you have multiplied disobedience more than the nations that are all around you, have not walked in my statutes, nor kept my judgments, nor even done according to the judgments of the nations that are all around you. Why? Because the Gentile nations are generally ignorant of God's laws, and they're steeped in paganism for thousands of years, and they don't have the same blessings as the heritage that the English-speaking peoples, the Israel of the Bible in this modern day have. Ezekiel continues, indeed, I, even I, am against you and will execute judgments in your midst in the sight of the nations, and I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I will never do again, because of all your abominations. Therefore, fathers shall eat their sons in your midst, and sons shall eat their fathers, and I will execute judgments among you. And all of you who remain I will scatter into all the winds. Verse 12, 1/3 of you will die by the pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst. 1/3 will fall by the sword all around you, and I will scatter the other third into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. Many other passages in the Bible, Amos, Jeremiah, other places parallel these horrible things that will happen. Again, Deuteronomy 28, in Leviticus, we see these same kinds of curses that God warned ancient Israel would come upon them if they didn't obey what they knew God expected. Ezekiel 7, verses 7 through 9, God says he'll send the worst of the Gentiles to punish his people, Israel, at this time. But this unprecedented time of trouble will not just affect the descendants of Israel and the church. Tribulation will come across the entire earth, and the existence of human life is going to be threatened altogether. And of course, that goes into the 6th and 7th seals for later Bible studies. Matthew 24, verse 21 and 22, Jesus prophesied, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened, before all humankind annihilates humanity from the face of the earth. Jesus Christ will step in. The Father will say, 'Son, it's time.' And like lightning flashes from east to west, Jesus Christ will be seen and will take over the rule of the earth at that time." So we're told to keep watch, that the fulfillment of end-time prophecies are like the ripening of figs on a fig tree. Matthew 24, verse 32 and verse 33, Jesus says this, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and starts to put forth those tiny leaves, you know that summer is near." When you're a planter and you're a farmer or rancher, or you have fig trees on your property. "So you also, when you see these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." So God, through Jesus Christ, said we can know the signs of the times. We do not know the day or hour of Christ's return. Only the Father knows. Not even the angels know, we're told. But Jesus says, watch, therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Luke 21, verse 36. So again, there are many hopeful things in the future, which I didn't even get into. These are some of the darker days that must come before the nations are humbled and before they're contrite enough to come and learn God's ways, and so that God can begin to teach all the nations. And a lot of things have to still happen, but we're also told to pray always that we'll be accounted worthy to escape those things which are on the horizon, and that God would deem us worthy to be in a place of protection, and our family members. With that, we've concluded this Bible study. Again, another one we'll talk about the sixth seal and then the seventh and so forth. And at this time, I'd like to ask our song leader, Mr. Chris Lydon, to lead us in a hymn, and then we'll have our announcements.